Good afternoon. This is Michelle Young, the Executive Director of the University Council for Educational Administration, with the UCEA webinar series on educational leadership. The series, which is co-sponsored by UCA and the Wallace Foundation, continues today with a discussion of a new report sponsored by the Wallace Foundation focused on the new educational entrepreneurs. With us today is Dr. Paul Manna, who's a professor at the College of William and Mary, and he led the research on this project and co-authored the report with his colleague Susan Moffett. Welcome, Paul.
Hello. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I was glad to get it and to hear that you and your group that you're interested in these topics. So I'm glad to have a chance to chat.
Absolutely. I want to tell the listeners a little bit about you, Paul, before we get started. Paul is the Paul R. Verkyle Associate Professor of Public Policy and an Associate Professor of Government at the College of William and Mary. Paul's research and teaching center on policy implementation, federalism, bureaucracy, and applied research methods. He has published a number of articles and chapters on topics of federal education policy, school choice, and state education governance, including publications like School is In, Federalism, and National Education Agenda, which examines the evolving relationship between federal and state education policy since the 1960s, and Collision Course, Federal Education Policy Meets State and Local Realities, which assesses the No Child Left Behind implementation from 2002 to 2009. His recent policy report, and the focus of our conversation today, is titled New Education Advocacy Organizations in the U.S. States, a National Snapshot and Case Study of Advance Illinois. This report, which examines the characteristics and priorities of 62 education advocacy organizations, also looks into how they've contributed to policies and factors associated with their success. So we'll start with the report. And we were interested, Paul, in having you tell us a little bit about the background on this project, what spurred your interest in it, and how you got involved.
Sure. So there's a more recent part to that story, but then a longer term part also. The first book that you mentioned, School's In, that was my dissertation project, became my first book. When I was working on that, I was focusing mainly on this interaction between the federal government and the states, as a way to help understand how policy has changed over time. And many of my interview respondents during that project kept reminding me, when you talk about the states, you should really be attentive to the great diversity that exists in the states, diversity institutionally, sort of the centers of power, things like that. And so that was an idea that I had in the back of my mind, and I kind of kept it, and really it became sort of my next research agenda. So for the last 7 or 8 years, I've spent a lot of time looking at states and their institutions, things like state education departments, state boards of education, governors and their role, looking to see how have their policies changed and what's been the relationship to outcomes, both policy outcomes and for students. And so that interest has kind of moved a little bit more with the project that we're talking about today, because previously I'd mainly just studied state institutions themselves, and I hadn't spent much time looking at groups on the outside, interest groups and others that attempt to influence state policymakers. And so the Wallace Foundation was interested in this topic, and I was interested in this topic, and so that's what got me on to the specific work that we're talking about today.
So I'm not sure that everybody here who's listening today has a good sense of what policy entrepreneurs actually are, and I don't know how familiar folks are with Mentrum's Policy Entrepreneur Framework. Can you tell us a little bit about that, maybe break down the features for us?
Sure. So in general, and there are lots of different ways that people have defined this idea, but in general, I think it's safe to say that policy entrepreneurs they're advocates. People can be advocates, say, inside of government, an elected official, a key staff member in an agency, or maybe on a legislative committee. So advocates inside government, they could also be from the outside of government, people who lead advocacy groups, organized interests, and others who have some commitment. They devote their time, their energy, their resources to trying to get certain policy objectives accomplished. So getting policies passed, sometimes even seeing that they're carried out well, those kinds of things. So Mintrum's framework, he has a number of different dimensions to the framework, and we can go into some of the details later if people want. But the basic idea is to say, let's look at these people and see what kinds of messages do they advance? In other words, what are they trying to say? How do they communicate it? So the methods by which they communicate it, the venues where they show up with their message to try to convince people that it's a good one, and also with whom. So are they talking to groups inside of government, outside of government to help rally support for some larger kind of effort, things like that. And so one of the things that Mintrum talks about is when these entrepreneurs are successful, they have this strong ability to put forth ideas that are compelling, that engage a lot of audiences, friends and foes alike, and that also help them to understand, the different that some people who might be perceived as your enemies might actually not be your enemies if you take the time to listen to them and learn a little bit more about their perspective. So that's the basic gist of the framework. There's one important caveat that I think is worth mentioning, is that even though the term that he chose to use, policy entrepreneurs, is the label, people shouldn't think that that only means that policy entrepreneurs advocate for market-based or market-oriented approaches to policy. The word entrepreneur maybe would connote that, but really it's simply anybody who has some interest and some energy and some investment in trying to get policy changed in a certain direction or moved in a certain direction. Those could involve advocating for market-based approaches, but they could also involve advocating for non-market-based approaches to policy as well.
No, a very important distinction, and I think it's probably worth mentioning that Mintrum works within the Australian context primarily. Is that right?
That's where he is now. Yeah, he's based his university. He's at a university in Australia. He did his graduate studies in the United States, so he studied the United States for his graduate work, his project that developed this framework, and now he's kind of taken these ideas. And I actually just saw him at a meeting last spring, and he was fascinated by the discussion and just seeing the different arenas where this idea has kind of traveled. So it's definitely a useful concept for education, but he's seen it popping up in all kinds of other places as well.
So let's talk a little bit more about these different organizations that have been identified as new entrepreneurial education organizations. You list among them organizations like Student First, Democrats for Education Reform, the 50-State Campaign for Achievement Now, 50CAN. As you point out within your report, these really are new educational entrepreneurial organizations. Most of them have been established within the last 10 years. Is that right?
Yeah, we saw, and the answer to that is yes, and there's a bit of a caveat to that too. Because there is no, say, census of these groups conducted at regular intervals, the one thing that we can't quite know for sure is whether there were lots of these groups active, say, 20 years ago, or 25 years ago, and then some of these groups just sort of died out or got absorbed into other kinds of things. From our best understanding, reading the secondary literature and talking with people who've worked in the education policy sector for a long time, they attest that yes, it does seem like these kinds of groups that we're talking about today are a pretty current, more modern phenomenon. And if you look at some of the results in the report, I know the readers will have access to, the listeners have access to it, there's also been a huge growth in these groups. One of the things we point out in the report, since the adoption of the race to the top initiative. So lots of these groups have sort of emerged in that context, out of that context, which it does sort of make sense if you think about the kinds of things that Race to the Top was trying to advocate for, and the fact that it made states, obviously the key players in that.
So, if you were thinking about these new organizations versus some of the more traditional organizations that have been in play for many years, what would you say are their distinguishing characteristics? Like, what makes them different, and why is that important?
Right. So, yeah, it's a really good question, and it is a really important issue to raise. We found there to be two main differences between the groups that we're studying and groups that we called or referred to as traditional education advocacy organizations. So and these two features are related. One difference is that the funding for these new groups tends to come from outside sources and instead of memberships. So I guess I should say the first obvious distinguishing characteristic is that these are really groups without members. They don't have large membership roles. They're not like a group, like UCEA even, or teacher unions or superintendents associations, where the people who make up the group, the people who make decisions about the group's priorities are the members. These kinds of groups don't have members typically. They will have people who sign up for membership lists, email, newsletters, things like that. But the vast majority that we looked at don't have members. And so because of that, they don't have a steady flow of member dues, to help pay for their activities. And that leads to the second point, which I was just alluding to, which is the funding that these groups rely on comes primarily from foundation support. Sometimes it's large national foundations. The Gates Foundation has been a big supporter of these kinds of groups. But also you'll get supporters that are state and local oriented foundations. The group that we studied, Advance Illinois, has a lot of those kinds of supporters as well. So that, I think, is the main distinguishing feature. It's not that these groups are advocates and traditional groups are not advocates. All kinds of groups advocate for different policy agendas. But this issue of not having members and then the implication that that has for funding it seemed to us, the biggest bright line that distinguished these groups from others. If I could add one other thing also, within the universe of these new education advocacy groups, there also was a distinction that we made in the report that I think is maybe worth mentioning here too, is some of these groups are groups that participate as sort of satellites of a national group. So the 50 CAN organization that you mentioned, they have satellite groups in different states. Democrats for Education Reform, right? They're a national organization, but they have satellites in different states. And similarly, another one that is organized this way is Stand for Children, right, with a national organization and satellites within individual states. Those were the three biggest networks that we looked at. But then you have groups like Advance Illinois that don't participate in those kinds of formal networks. They're basically a standalone group within an individual state. And so lots of groups have that type of orientation as well. They certainly talk with or trade ideas with groups across the country, but they're not organizationally, a satellite type group like these others.
So that's really helpful in terms of distinguishing them from some of the newer groups. I wonder too. We had a question from Linda Feldstein, which you answered part of her question about where the funding is from. But she was also wondering where these policy entrepreneur organizations come from. And you mentioned that new policy streams, like for example, related to the Race to the Top funding and so forth. But are there other characteristics about this last 10-year period that have made this a kind of a fertile ground for these organizations?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. I think one thing that has contributed to this is just the increasing demands that have been placed on states and state institutions, and the increasing focus that our policies now have on the states. So I think, a lot of people who study elementary and secondary education policy, they have in mind that the federal government has become this really gigantic player in that arena. And it's clear that the federal role is bigger now than it was, say, 30 years ago, or even maybe 20 years ago. But even as it has grown, what has really happened, I think this is the more important story, is state responsibilities for executing federal policy have grown even larger. So now that states are playing a bigger role, and that they have these increasing demands, and that the choices they make in their own policies have huge consequences. I think these groups have identified states as venues where they can try to have their influence. So I think that longer trajectory of states becoming more consequential players in the system, I think that has fostered this as well.
I'm glad that you brought up the Advance Illinois example, because I've been meaning to ask you. I was at a recent meeting hosted by the Illinois State Leadership Advisory Council, and that is a statewide policy and action stakeholder group that is focused on improving education leadership preparation and practice within the state of Illinois, and it's kind of a development building on some of the some of the work they've been doing there for almost 15 years now in this area. When I was at the meeting, it appeared that Advance Illinois played a pretty significant role in helping to roll out that initiative and get it off the ground. And I was wondering whether you feel like Advanced Illinois is a fairly special case in terms of the way that they operate. You mentioned that they don't have the state-by-state affiliates like Students First, but they're working in such an embedded and networked way. I was really taken with that.
Sure. So this is one area where I think my comments are a little bit tentative, given that Advanced Illinois was, as the folks will see in the study, that was the only group that we studied in depth. So we know a lot about their work, really down to the ground level, sometimes the blade of grass kind of level of detail. The other 61 groups in our study, we didn't get into that kind of depth on them, so it's hard to say for sure. But based on what we do know and what we did learn in the report, I would say that Advanced Illinois does seem somewhat unique in the degree to which it works with traditional institutions, I think. And this is something that I think, were observing in the Illinois State Leadership Advisory Council. I don't know a lot about that group in particular, but I would assume from the title and the fact that you were invited to the meeting that it probably contains groups that we would call traditional, right? Universities, schools of education, probably the state education agency or other relevant state agencies. And it was interesting to us as we did the study to see the degree to which Advanced Illinois actually works sort of hand in hand with these groups. That's in a bit of a contrast to the way some of these groups have been described in other reports. There's a pretty well-known report on this sector that describes them as rabble-rousers. And so the connotation there suggests that these groups really are about stirring the pot, making things uncomfortable for the traditional actors, the traditional institutions, the traditional leaders, and trying to kind of push things forward. Now, I think Advanced Illinois does some of that work as well. They do some of that stirring the pot, and they do try to make people uncomfortable in certain matters, but that is coupled with this willingness to engage and to work with these more traditional players, not just bashing them over the head with arguments about how badly they're doing, which is what some groups do, but they actually work in pretty constructive ways, and we can talk in more detail about that as well.
So it seems like there's a real continuum in terms of the strategies that the different groups use, or what they consider to be effective strategies, really.
I think that's right. Yeah, some of the groups that we looked at, for example, like Advanced Illinois, their main arena for their work is state government and state education agencies. They do some work locally, but that's a really smaller piece of their work. And I know, and this is something I know they've reflected a lot about, and they've thought a lot about whether they should be more engaged with ground level groups, and if they want to do that, how will they do it? Because right now they're not really built for that. They have an outreach component that tries to do that, but it's relatively small compared to the other dimensions of their work. Other groups that we looked at tended to be more ground level in their orientation, yet they did have this connection to trying to influence state policy. And other groups even still were even more narrow, let's say, in their state level orientation, with a focus mainly on things like trying to just change laws in the legislature, and they didn't really have as much investment in trying to work with state education agencies or state boards in the development of things like regulations and other things, toolkits for implementation, things like that. So there is this variety. The one thing another piece on here, though, that relates to your question about whether Advanced Illinois is typical, is it did strike us as interesting that if you look across these groups, even though the strategies are somewhat diverse, or can be somewhat diverse, they all have a pretty similar set of issues that they are pushing. The agendas within these groups across the states are pretty similar. There's a lot of advocacy for Common Core. There's a lot of advocacy for reforms in teacher preparation and evaluation, school turnarounds, these kinds of things. Some groups are more enthusiastic about school choice than others, so that one, there's a little bit more variation there. But things like the teacher evaluation reforms and some of the other, the Common Core type work, that's a pretty uniform set of issues that these groups have picked up. So even though they are diverse and they work in diverse settings, a lot of the advocacy agendas look pretty similar.
And the size of these organizations, one of the questions from Kim Rodriguez was whether or not these new entrepreneurial groups include professional educators or educational administrators. And from my read of your report, that would probably be a no, that most of these organizations are fairly small. Their headquarters staff are
right,
one or two people in some cases.
Yeah, so the ones that are mainly the one or two people, that group is dominated by the Democrats for Education Reform group, because that group tends to be, that group is different than the other groups in that it's a political action committee, right? It raises money to give to candidates to help elect certain candidates to office. The other groups don't operate that way. They operate in the 501c3 nonprofit category. So the DFER groups with the one staff member, that's basically like a point person. We interpret that as it's a point person in the state who's helping to raise money for electioneering purposes. But you're right, as far as the staff goes, they're not huge groups. Advanced Illinois, I think the number that we counted for them was like 12 or 14 staff. So it's not huge numbers of people that are doing this work. Do they include professional educators or not? To Kim Rodriguez's question, they do and they don't. So some of these groups have people working for them, and in fact, if another part of the report, one of the things we did is we did a content analysis of the bios of the executive directors of all these groups. And if you look at that particular part of the report, one thing you will see is that a lot of these executive directors actually did have some prior experience working in education in a more traditional role, either as a classroom teacher, maybe an administrator, something like that. So some of them do have that connection. The other thing that some of these groups have done is they've created advisory boards of people who have these connections to other professional educational circles. So people who have been teachers in the past or who have had other jobs in school districts or state agencies, sometimes even federal agencies. you see that popping up. So there is sometimes a connection to these kinds of groups through the backgrounds of the people that work there. And one thing that was hard to get a handle on is it was typically only the executive directors and the board members for whom we could find biographical information. It's hard to know about the other staff members that work for these groups, whether they have had similar kinds of experiences as well.
You may recall that in September I forwarded you an article from the Educational Researcher that was written by Sarah Reckhow and Jeffrey Snyder. It came out in May of this year, and it was called "The Expanding Role of Philanthropy in Education Politics." But basically, they were charting how philanthropic involvement in education politics has become more visible, and they've kind of changed their strategies. And I'm getting to the question here.
That's all right.
The questions that came up earlier about, where's the funding from, and then this article, this kind of companion piece, the Reckhow and Snyder piece about the strategies that many of these funders are using, trying to actually impact policy now. One of our questions from our listeners was from David at East Spicer, and he asks, is this a distortion of the democratic process? To what extent does this provide cover for, the agendas of these organizations that are funding and or outside of public scrutiny?
Sure, it's a great question. It's really this issue of democratic voice and representation. These are some big issues that we tried to engage in the report, and people we interviewed in the field were certainly talking about these things too. I think I would answer that by saying, first, thinking about the larger context. Foundations have been involved in elementary and secondary education for a long time. We hate, the work that's happening now. Certainly there are some differences, but if you wind the clock back to the 1960s and 70s and 80s, groups like the Ford Foundation, Annenberg. Some of you out there listening maybe remember the Annenberg Challenge and all of the money that Annenberg was pumping into urban systems. This is not new in a sense, right? The involvement of foundations. What I think is new is this some of the policy agendas that these groups have picked up, right? And I think that's the thing that kind of maybe rubs their critics the wrong way. It's not foundation involvement per se, right? I mean, a lot of people who object to what the Gates Foundation is doing around Common Core, they wouldn't object if, say, the Ford Foundation wanted to spend a lot of money to improve pre-K opportunities for kids, right? So I think it has something to do with the content of the agendas that makes people raise this concern. Still, whether it's Annenberg or Gates or whoever or a local foundation, I think the issue of democratic accountability is important. The issue of transparency is important. So when these groups are taking money from other groups and spending it, it's important for individuals to be able to know that, right? To be able to know sort of where the funding is coming from and who is backing certain ideas. So I think it's a really important question. These groups that are 501c3s, they do file federal tax reports that disclose some of this information. It's not always entirely clear, but there are ways to get a hold of some of it. Some of these groups are very transparent on their websites, their homepages, their annual reports. Others are not. So it is a bit of a dicey area, definitely, and I think we should be attentive to it and ask these hard questions of these groups, because it is harder to know who they represent, right? It's easier to know who UCEA represents than it is to know who Advanced Illinois represents, and that in part is really just because one is a membership-based group, one is non-membership-based, and it takes money from these kinds of sources.
Yeah, it sounds like that was a bit of a challenge to to do the inquiry around that particular question.
It is, and I'm glad you mentioned Sarah Reckow, because she's probably the person who's on this issue more than anybody else in the academic world these days. So if people are more interested in reading about this, she has a book that came out recently that looks at, it's an Oxford University Press book that looks at the role of foundations in general, but then has a couple of case studies of urban communities where they've played a big role. So I'm not getting any royalties for mentioning that, by the way. I just think it's a really good book, and if people want to learn more, that's a really great place for them to look.
Good to know. So when you were looking at these organizations, Paul, how did you what were they, or what did you use as kind of an indicator of how successful they were?
Right. This is something that we really tried to answer that for Advance Illinois. We didn't really try to answer that for the other groups, in part because it's just, in order to speak with confidence on that issue, we felt like we really needed to go into some depth on particular groups. And since Advance Illinois was the only one for which we were doing that, our conclusions about effectiveness are sort of confined to that particular case. But we really had two different broad areas that we were trying to look at to judge effectiveness. And one was the degree to which discussion about issues was different as a result of the group's work. So the way that the media covered things, the way that public officials or leaders of agencies and groups talked about these issues, did it seem like the things that Advance Illinois wanted to talk about and the way that they were talking about, were those things being picked up in these kinds of circles? And then the other thing that we looked at was to get beyond discussion to see, all right, what about the content of the policies that states or the state agency regulations, things like that? What about the content of the policies that we are seeing come on board in Illinois? Is there some evidence that you could find the footprints or the handiwork of Advance Illinois in the content of those policies? And so we used as a basis for judgment the statement of what did Advance Illinois say that it wanted to try to accomplish, right? What were their goals? And then we judged the discussion of those topics and then the policy adoption dimension to see whether they had actually done the kinds of things that they had promised or that they would do, that they said they would try to do. One thing we did not try to do was we did not try to pass judgment, because this just gets you into a whole other set of issues. You could write another 90-page report about just that, on whether they have chosen the right set of issues, right? That's a debatable question. So discussing whether Advance Illinois has moved the agenda and saying that means they've been successful or not based on their own, objectives, that's one thing. But then saying, is that agenda the right agenda, that's a different issue. And so that's something we didn't really get into in detail, even though we do have some comments on sort of broader questions that raises. So that was really the way that we looked at it, the nature of discussion and then the content of policy measured against what the group said it wanted to try to do.
So do you feel like you had, at least in the case of the Advanced Illinois, that you had a really pretty substantive idea of what this organization was doing, why they were doing it, and how well they felt like they were achieving their goals?
I think so. I think we looked at a lot of different sources of evidence, and there's a research appendix that accompanies the report, and so one of the things that readers can do is they can look and see the kinds of evidence that we use to try to gather information about them. And then we made sure that we examined evidence that was supportive of their work. We interviewed people who were supportive, but we also interviewed people who were critics of their work. So we feel like we had a pretty broad range of information that we were examining. And so yeah, we feel like we were able to more or less take the pulse of the group and have an understanding of what they were after and how they felt they were doing.
So thinking about that case study, but then also the kind of the more broader brushstrokes that you used on the other 62 organizations, what would you say was the most thought-provoking finding?
I think all 80 pages of it are incredibly thought-provoking. Seriously, maybe that's just because it was such a bear to write it up and to put it all together. But seriously, I think there are a couple of main issues that stood out to me and Susan as we were reading it. Some implications for groups like Advanced Illinois, and I know one of the issues that you and I have talked about, and you were one reason why you thought the UCEA audience would be interested in this, is what would be the implications for UCEA or others like it, right? Other groups like it, if they were trying to think about advocacy and some of these strategies. So the two main issues that I thought were most thought-provoking, one was what we in the report describe as an implementation dilemma. So on the one hand, these groups, Advanced Illinois and others like them, have gotten, in some cases, to be pretty good at having influence on policy, right? They have connected to key leaders in government agencies and legislative committees and governors' offices, and they've connected to other interest groups. They've forged coalitions, and they actually have had some success moving policy in a certain direction, in the direction they prefer. But what is true in a lot of these cases, in Advanced Illinois' case especially, we point out that they're a group built for advocacy. They're not a group that's been built for implementation. And so there's a worry, there's a concern that they may take these issues of implementation too lightly, or not think about enough of the nuances and think about enough of the potential unintended consequences that might be negative. And so we kind of phrase this as a dilemma, because on the one hand, these groups may be able to advocate well and get certain things passed, but if there's a risk that they're not going to be carried out well, or that maybe they're not able to be carried out well because of how these policies are designed, then that's going to reflect badly on their advocacy agenda, because they put out the agenda in the first place promising that it was going to be something great, right?
Can you give an example or two of that?
Right. So, I mean, we're seeing this all over the country now, right, with some of the teacher evaluation kinds of policies that have been passed, where states have passed these things, often with support of groups like Advanced Illinois, and then it turns out that these things are pretty difficult to implement. You know, principals and other supervisors haven't gotten the training needed in order to be good evaluators. Or it turns out that the new evaluation systems are showing results a lot like the old evaluation systems, and so does that mean they're being carried out badly? Does that mean that that's just the nature of the policies themselves? What does that actually mean? And so I think there is sometimes, you know, an engagement and an interest in the say the legislative battle or the energy that accompanies the crafting of policy, and there's not as much energy or attention on the sort of the hard work of actually carrying out policy. And I think that could be a challenge that some of these groups will face, because they're built for advocacy, they're not built for implementation. And so how can they become effective at helping these policies to be carried out? It's kind of a tough question for them to answer. There is one group, if people wanted to look in depth at a group that perhaps has figured out how to solve that dilemma. It's a group called Mass Insight Education that operates out of Massachusetts. They began in the early 90s. They're one of the older groups in our collection. They began in the early 90s as more or less an advocacy group that helped to get some of the earlier Massachusetts state policy changes going and enacted. And then what happened over time is the group basically transformed itself into becoming a more capable and higher capacity professional development, professional service provider. And so now the group, it does advocacy, but it also does a heck of a lot of training and implementation and toolkit development and work within school districts on the ground. I was just in another project in a school district where, you know, it was the district far away from Massachusetts, but there was a Mass Insight staff member working hand in hand with them. So that's a group that has sort of remade itself in a way to become more focused on implementation. And so it'll be kind of interesting to see whether other groups like these groups kind of take that trajectory. So that's one. That implementation dilemma was one big, pretty interesting finding that we talked about. Another one is this shift that some of these groups are going to have to make. It's sort of another shift, going from being a critic of the status quo to being a defender of the status quo, and all that entails. So being an advocate for Common Core, when Common Core has not really been adopted yet, is one thing, but now that it's adopted and people are trying to carry it out, that's a different kind of role. And so shifting from being a critic of the status quo to defending the status quo will be something that these groups will have to get used to as well.
Do you have any plans to do a follow-up of this study, like 10 years from now?
I don't know. We can do the webinar again in 2019, I can tell you. But there is at least one study that Susan and I are going to do. We'll have a draft version of it ready for the spring. We're interested in examining the question of where do these groups show up, right? Where do they, not in terms of particular agencies or venues, but in which states do we find them? Because not all states have an Advanced Illinois type group or a DFIR type group. And so we thought this was an interesting question. It's a sort of a descriptive question, but it's an interesting question to ask nevertheless, because it gets back at some of the other issues we've been talking about, issues of representation, issues of, you know, what is really motivating these groups. Are they showing up in states where there really is some sort of demonstrable need, and sort of they're a group that can help address those needs? Are they groups that show up more frequently in states where there's just a friendly political climate and people who want to advance a certain agenda have allies already on the scene, and so these groups are set up as a way to help move that agenda, whether there's a deep need or not? There are a lot of different potential explanations for why these groups are in some places but not others, and so that's the next step that we're going to take. We're going to try to expand the menu of groups. We're going to go beyond the 62 that we have in this report to try to be a little bit more comprehensive, and then we'll see what we find. I'll just a plug for listeners who may be going to the AERA meetings in Chicago next spring. We're actually going to be presenting this paper at a different conference, the Midwest Political Science Association meeting, but it's actually in Chicago at the same time as the AERA meeting. So if AERA gets boring and you want to sneak over to the Palmer House, you know, you can come to our panel and hear us present this paper.
We'll be sure to let everybody know.
Yeah.
So a minute ago, you mentioned UCA is interested in other types of implications of your work. So the report itself focuses on implications for these entrepreneurial organizations as well as for their funders. But as I think you're aware, UCA published a research brief that was suggesting that colleges of education also might be able to think about some of the strategies that these organizations use. And I was just wondering, you know, what are your thoughts on other organizations thinking about some of the strategies that these organizations are using? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that I think were especially relevant out of what we learned from Advance Illinois and their approach. And again, just to give it a little bit of a context, Advance Illinois is a pretty new group. They were brand new in 2008, so they've been around for about 6 years now. And one strategy that they followed, especially early on in their time as a group, when they were trying to kind of get their footing and figure out what their agendas would be. Remember, that was before Race to the Top. So in 2008, they weren't thinking about necessarily all of the same things that they were thinking about in 2009 and 2010. So in that first year or so of their launch, one of the things that they did was they had a lot of meetings around the state of Illinois with interested parties, interested stakeholders, typically public officials and people of that type. They essentially had what I would just call meetings without agendas. They were coming together just to kind of find out what other groups are all about, what their concerns are, what their priorities are, etc. And I think, given the sort of generally polarized kind of environment that exists in the country now around politics, and given the especially polarized environment that exists around some of the top issues on the kind of the education policy debates, I think more of those meetings could actually be quite helpful. Groups might actually find themselves surprised, at what they hear from other groups. Maybe there's more in common than they might expect. I'm not trying to be all kumbaya here or anything, because there are real disagreements, but I think those kinds of, if we are ever going to get to a state where we have great opportunities for students across the country regardless of where they live, then we're going to need all hands on deck. And so some of these kinds of meetings, which openly invite the critics of one's perspective to them, I think this can help. So that's one thing that I think might be useful. And I guess from UCEA's point of view in particular, I mean, you all know that colleges of education are often on the ropes, right? They're often kind of the punching bags of groups that think that these colleges really need to change, that we should shut down a bunch of them, that there are all kinds of problems. And certainly there's room to improve, but again, I think if some of the critics were in the room and they were hearing from you all what it was you were asked to do or required to do by the law, or how, sort of the capacity of your organizations to do things, I think there could be some real learning across all sides. So that's one, that this meetings without agendas idea was kind of an interesting thing that we saw. The other thing that we saw that also could be a positive, and UCEA could envision some different ways, and groups like it could envision some different ways to do this, is to think about working on some projects together with other groups that are sort of very concrete, specific, and let's say, have a pretty clear deliverable that isn't very controversial. So this doesn't mean you all have to get together and team up and have the same advocacy agenda, because you still might disagree on things. But for example, an example that we learned of in Illinois was there's an event that happens every summer there for the last couple of summers. It's technically run by the state education agency. It's called I'm going to botch the name, but it's something like the Education Leadership Institute, or the Teacher Leadership Institute. And so what they do is the state chief in the state, Chris Cook, he invites, I think it's between like 30 and 60 teachers from around the state who have been somehow distinguished. Maybe they've been award winners or been sort of noted as leaders in their communities. They come to an institute in the summer for it's a few days, and learn about some of the hot button topics that the state is trying to engage. Now, the facilitating and the running of that meeting is done by state education agency staff, by Advance Illinois staff, and also by state teacher union affiliates. So they all get in the same room together, they all work together to try to pull off this event, and the bonus is it engages teachers, and it helps, there's often the complaint that the policymakers don't hear the voices of teachers. This is a venue where that actually happens. And because it's a pretty safe space, right? It's not like there's a controversial policy that everybody has to agree on that is now going to be advocated for. It's more or less providing a venue for people to learn about what are the issues at the top of the agenda of the state and of the state education department, and what do we all need to know about them. So that kind of concrete, sort of uncontroversial type project is one that advocacy groups could facilitate. You know, a group like UCEA could try to facilitate those kinds of things, and maybe you all already do that. So I'm kind of talking out of turn here, but that would be another example.
Thanks, and it raised a couple of questions from our listeners. So, for example, if the University of Virginia were to schedule a meeting without an agenda, it has some clout within the state, so it would sort of has legitimacy and so forth. That something like that seems like something that they should be able to pull off. And then also, the idea of working on projects with other groups, that whole notion of collective impact is so incredibly important. One of the questions that was raised, though, is so if these new advocacy organizations are so new, like Advance Illinois being established in 2008, how did they so quickly develop the legitimacy and the power to be a convening force within the state?
It's a great question, and you should read the report, the person who asked that. We talk about that a lot. In part, it was a conscious strategy of the people who formed the group. So one of the things that I think Advanced Illinois has done as well as, or perhaps better than almost all these other groups across the country, is that they convened a group of top people in the state, well-known people, well-regarded people from across the political spectrum to serve as board members for the group. And so on that board, and you can see who they are when you go to the if you go to the report, you've got former governors, both Republican and Democrat. Importantly, governors from Illinois who aren't in jail or have jail time coming because they've had a problem in Illinois with that. So you've got those types of people. You have people who have been very well-known business folks in the state. You have very well-known foundation people in the state. You have very well-known social activists within the state, and some within Chicago as well. And notice everything, when I mention all these people, I keep saying in the state, in the state, in the state. It gave them incredible credibility. So even though they were taking money from the Gates Foundation to help them bankroll their activities, it would be really hard for a critic to say that this is a group that is sort of an AstroTurf group that's been set up by outside interests. You have so many people from lots of different points of view within the state who came together to be part of this group on its board. And I think that was a huge, huge factor that helped to embed them in lots of different institutions and to give them lots of different roles. Then you have some intangibles that are unique to Advance Illinois, and the board members clearly had been thinking about these things. So the person they hired to be the executive director of the group, her family is very well known in the state. Her father is a well-known business person and philanthropist in the state. Her sister is a member of the state legislature, right, who has obvious connections on committees and sort of knows things about the legislative agenda that the typical person wouldn't. So that also was a smart and savvy move, I think, from the board to pick a person who was already well positioned to have a lot of contacts and kind of a Rolodex of potential supporters almost already, instantly in place when the group launched. But it's really, really hard to overstate the importance of that board that they assembled. And people across the people that we interviewed repeatedly mentioned this as a key factor.
So they very nicely networked themselves into the state.
Exactly, and leverage pre-existing networks. They weren't building these networks from scratch in some cases.
One other part of the kind of our interest and implications is, colleges of education. They, at least the ones that are affiliated with UCEA, are all located within research institutions, and so they're contributing to the knowledge base as well as to the development of future educational leaders. And one of the concerns is, that you already raised, was just that sometimes, because some of the negativity towards higher education in general, they're not necessarily turned to as often as you would think that they would be, as a source of information and so forth. And this is particularly vexing given reports about research utilization by policymakers. So one of the questions that was raised was whether or not these new educational advocacy organizations are helping to direct policy makers to research. The report talks a lot about how they're helping to reframe these national policy trends within the state, but are they also helping to connect policymakers with relevant research-based strategies?
I think some of these groups clearly are, and again, you've got to kind of caveat that with the understanding that these groups are not, research. They're not university research centers, right? They have ideas that they think are important, and that they're persuaded by the research that they have seen that these are things that we should be doing. Mm-hmm. So while they do connect at least some of them, what we saw, try to connect their advocacy agendas to research, it doesn't mean that they are attentive to all of the nuances and sort of caveats and things that people like you and me would be attentive to, right? When we write a research study, that's not what Advanced Illinois' job. Their job is not to spend a lot of time on the nuance, because they're trying to get things adopted. And so with that in mind, one limitation, right, is that it will be a more limited read, perhaps, of the research than people in colleges of education or in other circles would prefer. But I think that's partly the nature of the kind of work that they do. They're not trying to write peer-reviewed articles when they craft their publications. They're trying to write persuasive, compelling, evidence-based policy proposals. Which I guess this circles way back to one of those points that I made earlier. What I thought the question you were going to ask me, and maybe this was your next question, I thought the question was going to be, what could universities do to get their research more in the hands of these kinds of groups, or what could universities or groups like UCEA do?
Question, yes.
I figured that one would be coming. So one area where I do think that universities, in particular, people who study education policy and its implementation, you all have a huge comparative advantage when it comes to matters of practice, right? And what it really takes to do the work in the buildings of schools and school districts across individual states and across the country. And that's something that these kinds of groups, by and large, there are some rare exceptions. I think Mass Insight is an exception. But the vast majority of these groups, as far as we can tell, they don't have that deep ground level knowledge. And as we know, policy is not what legislators say it is in their laws. Policy is what the teacher does at 10 a.m. in class on that day when they're teaching that lesson. Like, that's what the policy really is. And people who study education, be they in education departments or schools at universities, or someone like me in a government department or public policy program, we often spend a lot of time thinking about practice and thinking about implementation. And these groups don't. So this is one area where I think UCEA members and others have a huge comparative advantage, and they need to think about ways to get that knowledge out into the debate. Admittedly, it's hard because implementation is not as sexy as legislative battles in committees or things like that. People's eyes often gloss over when you talk about that. But honestly, that's really what's going to make this stuff work or make it fail, right? And I think that's an arena where your members and others, I think, like them, could, if they wanted to, play a more aggressive role.
Believe it or not, we're getting towards the end of our time together today, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share anything else from the report that you felt would be really helpful. Were there any surprises in the data? Anything that we failed to cover today?
I don't know. I think we really did hit a pretty good range of the topics that are in there. Because Susan and I are interested in continuing to work in this vein, we would be especially interested in the people tuning in today, or the people who will listen to this recorded later on. If you have any reactions to the report, or if you have any knowledge of certain conditions within your own state, groups that you think would be worth it for us to take a look at, we're definitely open to that. The one sort of interesting finding that we made in doing this work was that nobody has really ever published a systematic study of these kinds of groups. There's been sort of journalistic accounts of them and some consultants' reports written about them, but really nobody has tried to do the kind of painstaking analytical kind of work on this kind of scale. And so we hope that others will get interested in the topic, and if people want to chat about it or trade some messages about it, please, they shouldn't hesitate to contact me or to contact Susan, because we think it's a really interesting area that, for a lot of the reasons that the questioners mentioned, questions of democratic accountability and the effectiveness of policy implementation, this is a topic that really deserves more attention than it's getting right now.
And I would highly recommend that the listeners read the report authored by Professor Manna and his colleague Susan Moffett. It's available for download on the Wallace Foundation Knowledge website, and we're pulling that webpage up right now. In particular, I found the appendices to be very, very interesting. They provided a lot of really helpful tables. For example, Paul mentioned earlier the board of directors membership and so forth. Just really helpful.
Yeah, and the other thing that's interesting about the Wallace Foundation site there is one of the things that we were glad to have happen is that the Advanced Illinois staff actually wrote a commentary on the report that's included on the Wallace Foundation site as a separate document. So you can also hear their take on the report as well.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, well, thank you. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Paul. It's really been a pleasure. Very, very interesting, substantive conversation. Much appreciated.
Okay, sure. And I hope this is maybe the first of other conversations.
Absolutely. I'd also like to thank all of you who asked some very interesting and important questions that helped to extend our thinking on this issue, and of course the Wallace Foundation for supporting today's webcast. If you'd like to listen again, or if you'd like to share this with colleagues, it will be available on the UCA website prior to early next week. And I hope everyone has a tremendous week, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.